stay quiet, okay? Just stay right where you are.
I was at home in Cleveland and I saw it on the news. I saw that people were shot and wounded at a prayer meeting at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I knew the pastor, I knew some of the other clergy persons at that church. I just didn't know who had been injured or killed. And when I found out who it was, there was one fella, Simmons, we called him Super Simmons. We ran for bishop together in the AME Church. He was a personal friend. I just talked to him maybe 2 or 3 weeks prior to the incident. So I was very shocked. I just moved back to Pittsburgh, at that time pastoring Park Place in Homestead. We received a call from the news media. The AME Minister Alliance was called together. We were interviewed and we had a prayer vigil the same day that we got word of the incident.
We're looking right now at the Mother Emanuel Church. It is quiet there this morning in Charleston, but the city of Charleston and the nation still reeling over that tragedy, coming to grips with what happened.
I was so upset and flabbergasted the night that it happened. It was interesting, my son-in-law had called me to ask me if I knew about what had happened at Mother Emanuel. And I said, Mother Emanuel? He says, yes, in Charleston. I said, no, and I turned the television on, and they were showing some pieces from the event, and I kept looking for the pastor, who I know personally. We've been friends across the years. And I said, that's strange. I don't see Clemente. But I kept moving on, thought nothing about it. And then when the name started coming forth and his name came out, I said, boy, this was a great guy who was fighting for the people of South Carolina in the legal system, as well as serving as one of our pastors. Then there were other persons who I knew. We call him Super Simmons. They call him Reverend Simmons. We've all been friends at least 45 to 50 years. And for it to happen in Mother Emanuel was to say to us that no longer our church is sacred as they should be. However, we cannot allow ourselves to be victims of fear, but we have to open our churches so that whosoever will can come, which is the mandate of Jesus.
The first thing that I did is we raised an offering, and then myself and the former pastor of St. James AME Pittsburgh, Reverend Rodriguez Johnson Jr., we drove down to Charleston a couple of days later and went down there, gave the offering. They raised an offering as well with the promise of more. And we went down there to show support. I'll never forget the transition. There's a song that says, life is filled with swift transition. And that verse never made as much sense as it did from the time when we were driving down, being jovial, laughing. We got out of the car and we walked up to the church, and the mood just simply changed. At that time, there were flowers out there. There were a lot of people that were gathered, people that had not even been members of the church out of town were just sitting there crying. I think the most somber moment was when we walked in. They, had taken down the police tape and everything, but we had walked into the church. Most people weren't allowed to go into the church. And to sit there, we were waiting to talk to the presiding elder at the time, who was taking all types of appointments and everything, and to see still the holes in the walls that the bullets were extracted from, and to see the places where people had tried to clean up, but one of the problems with blood is it stains, and no matter how hard you clean or scrub, it takes time to get that up. And to see that, to go upstairs and to see faces and people, and to reminisce, but also to see the camaraderie that was forming, how a electric company had taken upon itself to volunteer to replace all the lights in the sanctuary that were out. And another company was sitting there and working on different parts of the church, trying to show support. So it was a myriad of different feelings. On the outside, it was very sad. It was very somber. You saw family members' pictures. You saw even some family members grieving in a way. So it was definitely a sense in which I've never experienced before.
It was a huge story. So it was covered in many different ways, which was appropriate. One was just a horrifying event. What happened? Here's the shooting. I mean, there, thank God, rare situations where somebody comes in and mows down 9 people. The next layer of that was you really got a chance to understand who those 9 people were. Media used to get, particularly journalists used to get criticized for sort of saying 9 people got shot, but okay, we don't know who they are or what they meant. And there was real information about who those people were in connection with their communities and that church. The result of which there's a library named after one of the women who was killed. And see, I know that only because they spent so much time talking about her, and she was a librarian and what she brought. Of course, we know there was a state senator, and that became important in the ongoing conversation because it was because of his death and the work he had been doing before his death to get that Confederate flag down in South Carolina, that people then wanted to stand up and respect his ongoing effort to get that flag down and his legacy after his death. So it was really covered in the multi-layered way you would hope that it would be covered. Now, there's always criticism that journalists move on from the story, and particularly national ones, and that's necessarily going to be true because that's not a story that's going to command the headlines every day. But I think overall the coverage was good. There were several national town hall discussions. The late Gwen Ifill on PBS went to South Carolina, held a town hall with the people there, and this was months later, so it wasn't, which is what you want. You want to have an opportunity to let some time pass and then come back. Several other journalists came and engaged in conversation and really talked about the issues of economic justice there or lack thereof. Just even knowing that Mother Emanuel, and it really is, as I've been there, right in the heart of a residential neighborhood. You just walk around the block and there are all these homes. It's weird. It's not where you think it would be. And so it becomes even more horrifying to know that this man just, close to all where people are living around. There were just many layers to it that I thought were covered quite well. Could there have been more done? I'm certain. But it's rare that you have network coverage of a funeral service. Now, of course, it was enhanced because President Obama attended, but they covered the whole funeral service so people could see that. And there was a lot of discussion with some of the survivors, a lot of discussion about what did that forgiveness mean. So I appreciate that. I'm trying right now to find fault with the coverage in my mind, and I actually can't remember anything that I thought was particularly egregious.
Well, the Elan Church is special because it was born in 1787 as a result of social injustice. And it has always been on the cutting edge of making sure all persons have the quality of life and the quality of relationship with God necessary. It allows everyone to feel that I'm a special person in the sight of God. As you look at our history, we grew because we came out because of the fact that in St. George Methodist Church in Philadelphia. They wanted us, who happened to have been what they called Africans at the time, called us to have to wait until the white Americans had been allowed to pray. And we walked out because of that kind of injustice, not because of some biblical thing, but because of social injustice. And we moved into becoming a benevolent society, the Free African Society. And since then, it's always been about a holistic approach to life.
Okay, the AME Church begins in 1787 with Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and some others who were attending St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. And after being denied prayer at a time which was not slated for African Americans to pray, they were asked to stop their prayers, get up off of their knees, and leave the church. Richard Allen said to those who were interrupting their prayer, "If you allow us to finish this prayer, we will never bother you again."
Well, there's a lot of, I was also involved in a documentary series called This Far by Faith, in which there was a series done about where African Americans began, what they brought over with them from Africa, how it morphed into Christianity, some Muslim, all of that, and what that means for black folks in general, and where does it interact with the struggle for justice.
Church has always been in the black community, the force that guided us. And enemies will go to the head or whatever the major piece is that guides a group to destroy that. And enemies or anyone who understands destruction understands if I can destroy the leader, if I can destroy the pivotal point, I can destroy everybody else.
The verdict coming in late today in Charleston. A jury deciding the death penalty for Dylan Roof, who walked into that church and then shot and killed 9 parishioners who had invited him to pray with them. Tonight, Dylan Roof's final words to the court. ABC's Steve Osinsami leading us off.
It took jurors only 3 short hours. The most appropriate sentence is death. The justice delivered to these church families tonight is bittersweet.
This verdict is a verdict for America.
22-year-old Dylan Roof will pay for the 9 lives he stole from the basement of this historic black church by giving up his. But none of this will bring their loved ones back. The husband and daughter of Myra Thompson tell us tonight they hope Roof finds God soon.
If there's one thing you want to tell him tonight, it's that he needs to find the Lord.
Yes. He definitely needs to, because Judgment Day is coming sooner for him than what he expected.
I believe in corporal punishment. I don't believe in the death penalty. I'd never preach an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He was found guilty. I feel he should have a life sentence without parole, but I also feel there ought to be some things put in place that will minister to his spirit and his soul. I hope he finds peace. I don't know how he's going to find peace, but all things are possible. But I think the sentence was well deserving. I commend the jurors and the judge and the system. I believe justice was done, but I still remember what the families said at that time, that they forgive him. And I think the forgiveness is easy, it's the forgetting that becomes difficult. So I always pray for us to forget as well as forgive, but also ask God to help him forgive himself. Because without that, he can never be at peace with himself. But I feel the sentence was justified in the sense that it was given.
Closing statements, Roof sounded calm and well thought. I felt like I had to do it, he told jurors, and I still feel like I have to do it. It's the same lack of humanity he shared in this handwritten jailhouse journal. I would like to make it crystal clear. I do not regret what I did. I am not sorry.
I felt that our church had been touched, very especially by the racial tension brought about by this young man who still has no remorse for what he has done. And that's what bothers me, that people can just move and destroy lives and take lives without being remorseful, for they should be, because of the fact that they did not give life, so they really have no right to take life. And so the Emmanuel situation has also caused us across denominational lines to come together as the body of Christ to stand against racism in this country, as well as to stand realizing that love is what handles every situation.
This young man made it clear when he had an opportunity to talk, do not feel sorry for me. I was very focused on going in there to kill these people, and my point was to make a point that white folks are superior. And you recall what he said to the woman that he left alive, is because I want you to go back and tell people exactly what I did. You know, he spots her and realizes she's not dead, and she's thinking he's going to shoot me, and he says, no, I want you to go tell somebody. And then there was all this speculation before he spoke about, well, he's, you know, mentally ill. Well, of course you're mentally ill if you go in and shoot 9 people. There is some level of, you know, disconnect from the real world. So that will cede to. But the way it was being framed was that his mental illness sort of drove him to do an irrational act, when in fact, within the irrationality of the mental illness that we know has to come with deciding you're going to kill folk, he was quite clear about his focus and what he meant to do. He wanted to sow a lot of upset, he wanted to divide the races, and he wanted to make it clear that white people were superior. And be ever so clear, he scouted many black churches and landed on Mother Emanuel because he thought this one had a bigger reputation, so whatever I do here will be more reported, and if I'm killed, I'll be a bigger martyr because I went down for the cause of white supremacy in this well-known church. So I think it, you know, for some people anyway, made them look at that we're not talking about people who are kind of mean to one person. We're talking about somebody who is now believes himself to have a mission to uphold all white people, and anybody else does not deserve to be alive even.
For me, I've been trying to put this thing together in my head. And what I've learned is that we need to have the conversation, but the conversation can only be had when we start to tell the truth. We have to tell the truth about this country. We have to say that the country was founded as a racist, white supremacist society. And Dylan Ruth was just a byproduct of that. So we have to start to talk about the truth.
We got a race issue in America, and we have to look at the man in the mirror as a nation and critique what we see, so that my sister, Cynthia Graham, heard the 8 others that died, the 5 others that was terrorized. The attack was an attack on a race of people. It was an attack on humanity. It was an attack on the Christian church. And so everyone should pause and take a look at what happened. Now, we can't say that we're months away from it and that we forgive. I have a forgiving spirit. I do not forgive. It is okay to be angry.
We have made it a mandate in the book of discipline, the book of laws of our church, that we celebrate the Emmanuel 9 every year. That's number one. That we put programs around so we remember the Emmanuel 9 and how they have impacted the life of our country through being able to be used as persons who stood for the inclusion of all people in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's number one. Number two, you ask, how can we ensure that this does not happen again? We can't. We just have to trust God to care for us. We use one of the gifts of the Spirit, which is the gift of discernment, And that gift helps us to feel an uneasiness about persons who may be within the confines of our congregation, who may not be in the congregation or in the experience of worship for the right reason. And so we do have trustees who are responsible, and our time calls for security for cars. And so those persons are already outside watching cars, not to kill anybody, but to protect the cars. But you cannot really put up a barrier to ensure that this doesn't happen again.
I would say that as a native Charlestonian, I am very disturbed about this national image of Charleston being so special, so unique, because we are so forgiving. I think it's a false message in many ways, mainly because the flip side of that is we should be asking, why is a community so beat down that it is afraid to show anger? We have a false dichotomy that says either I'm going to forgive or I'm going to be angry.
I think that anger, one of the first things is that whenever we get angry, we have to remember that anger is never a primary emotion. It's a secondary emotion. If somebody steps on my foot, I get angry typically because you scared me or you hurt me, or because you have scuffed my shoe and I feel embarrassed or I feel something. Anger is always a secondary emotion. But the one thing about that is that anger doesn't accomplish anything. And so anger only makes you reckless. Anger only makes you feel as though you're entitled to something. Anger causes a desire for you to retaliate, to cause for something to happen. But the problem with that is once anger rears up, there's nothing that can satisfy anger.
Hatred has never stopped. Hatred of race, as well as possibly religion, has always been a part of culture, especially in America. The preaching of hatred through the Ku Klux Klan and other racist organizations has embedded in many people the urge to kill or destroy or wipe out persons of color. It stems from basically what the church preaches against is sin. Love is to be the common denominator between all cultures and races of people. Whenever you deny that, you have hatred, to the point where a young Caucasian can come into a church during prayer meeting, can plot and plan to kill and take lives and destroy families. I can't pinpoint why a person would go that far in hatred, but hatred festers murder and destruction and all of those things.
What's a little bit distressing about that, the response to the Emmanuel church shooting, now it should have been great amounts of angst and great amounts of, tears because it was awful and there's no way of getting around that. But what got so much attention, as you know, are when the black folks were interviewed afterwards and said, "We forgive him." And, I think unless you really understand what that means in a faith context for folks, then it got interpreted as they just put aside all that he had done. And, later conversations, people were a little bit more clear for the audience. They knew for themselves, saying, listen, I didn't forget it. I'm forgiving. I'm rising to try to live out my faith in this way by forgiving him as I am instructed to do by Christ. That's what I follow. But it came off for many as, wow, look at these humble, always forgiving black people. It doesn't matter what you do to them. You can shoot all their relatives, and they're still going to forgive this guy. So I think it helped really to put things in proper balance and light for him to say what he had to say afterwards. That was really before he spoke. and also for the folks in the church, the survivors particularly, to come back and really speak about their pain and anger about it, and that they were trying, they still had that, but they were trying to rise to a different faith level of forgiveness.
Our church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, coming out of a black Afro-American concept, is a church of forgiveness. Even though it had taken place, we still forgave the brother. That's part of being Christ-like. That's part of being a Christian, to be a forgiver. Now, it takes some time to grow to that, but part of our church believes, part of our belief is that we have to learn to forgive people.
In my opinion, the black church has kind of dropped the ball, where we were in the forefront during the 50s and 60s and 70s in the civil rights movement. Many of our black churches are not involved in Black Lives Matter, other issues that deal with police brutality, and I feel the black church ought to be doing more. We're still doing some things, but we're not visible. It might be for lack of leadership within our communities, where in the 50s, 60s, and 70s you had black clergy persons who would assume the leadership positions and take the leadership positions. Now in contemporary society, the black church is not looked at the same, so the leadership doesn't necessarily spring out of the black church. Before, it was no alternative. As a pastor, as a black clergy person, you had to be involved because the black church was the center of the community. Now, with all of our modernization and technology, the black church, I feel, is not the center of the community. It still plays a vital part, but it's not held in such deep esteem as it used to be by millennials and what they have classified as Generation X. There are still some churches that are very visible, but on the overall, you don't have the number of clergy persons or churches visibly involved. We're still involved, but not to the level I feel we should be.
Storm cloud rising. Let's go. Storm cloud rising. Let's go. Storm cloud rising, let's go. Burdens done got a little heavy, I wanna go. Done got a little heavy, and I wanna go.